Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Hoko. I am the Executive Director for the Behavior Analyst Trade Leadership Council. We are a behavior analyst trade organization founded in 2015. We're committed to supporting behavior analysts serving as leaders, managers, and business owners. We've done multiple conferences in the Northeast, and I am real happy to report that we are headed to Miami on March 3rd to 5th of 2022 to the Hyatt Regency. And we are going to have or try to have a live conference, but there is also a virtual option. So if you're interested in that, the link is at the bottom of the page. That's Linktree Behavior Analyst Leadership. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest for the spotlight today, Mr. Patrick McGreevy. Pat, are you there?
I am there. Mm-hmm.
There you go. Hey, Pat. Pat has a doctorate from KU. I love those doctorates from KU. I happen to have one too. That's great. He's a student of Ogden Lindsley. He has taught numerous behavior analysis and precision teaching courses and hundreds of presentations, some keynote addresses and publications. He's an author of the EFL curriculum and assessment. So I'm going to stop my share at this point. And welcome, Pat, again. So, Pat, where are you hailing from today? Which part of the country?
I live in Winter Park, which is a suburban area of Orlando, Florida.
Oh, and how's Florida doing these days?
Weather-wise, it's very pleasant today, about 70 degrees. Politically and health-wise, we're not doing so well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we should stay away from those subjects and talk about behavior analysis like we wanted to do.
Good idea.
By the way, here it has just started snowing profusely. It is snowing like crazy, and I have a 17-year-old son doing a driving test tomorrow.
Oh my goodness. Whoa.
So, Pat, you know, we just met actually this year. I don't think we've met before this unless you and I have both forgotten about it. I've been in the field for a while, and you've been in the field for a long time. We're both from KU, and you know, the name Ogden Lindsley came up, and I actually met him several years ago. He was quite an interesting character, so hopefully we'll talk a little bit about him today. But I wanted to start with maybe getting people, you know, people know you for a lot of things, and lately for the EFL assessment, which is super popular out there. But what about Pat as the person? Can you tell us a little bit about, you know, your upbringing? Like, how were you as a child? Were you a good student? And were you planning on being a behavior analyst right from the start?
No, I in those days, we didn't use the term, so I don't think I'd have known what one was. In fact, the first time that I used the term behavior analyst to refer to myself was shortly after I took the Florida examination, which would have been about 1987. 88. And right. And even then, for a while after that, we didn't refer to ourselves as that. Most of us called ourselves consultants or educational consultants, because most of us were working either in adult programs for people with developmental disabilities, or we were in public schools working in special education classrooms. And people didn't know what that term meant, so we didn't use it for quite some time. But basically, to the earlier part of your question, and I grew up in the Midwest in Iowa. I was largely a product of Catholic school education. The sisters taught me skills to fluency, but didn't use that term. They referred to it as knowing something by heart. And we were very much indoctrinated into that. And I learned Latin at an early age, even though some of the words I didn't know what they meant right then. I learned what they meant later on.
So I have to ask, Pat, sorry to interrupt you, but no. Can you say something in Latin to us?
Sure. Introibo ad altare Dei. Deum qui laetificat juventutem meam. That is the first two lines of the Catholic Latin Mass.
Wow.
Verbatim.
Okay, that
Verbatim.
was great.
Yeah, yeah. And not, and then I ended up I was in the a seminary for a couple of years. I was studying to be a priest for a couple of years, and then left there. Ended up at the University of Iowa, finished a degree in psychology just because I wasn't sure what else to do. But then I discovered that psychology wouldn't accomplish anything for you, at least at the bachelor's level. So I ended up in special education and grew to love it enormously, especially the children who were more severely disabled. And this is long before anybody even talked about autism, let alone knew what it was.
Right.
And so then I got a master's degree in special education from the University of Iowa, and I started teaching, and I taught in a public school for 4 years. And eventually I became a doctoral student of Ogden Lindsley's and packed all my stuff into a little car and drove to Lawrence, Kansas, having never been there before.
All right, I got to ask this. So you were a teacher.
Yes.
And then all of a sudden you're going to, one of the meccas of behavior analysis in the beginning days where Baer and Risley and Lindsley and everybody was. How did that happen? How did that connection happen?
Well, I had been to a couple of workshops that Ogden had done on the road. One was in Denver that I distinctly remember. And I was incredibly impressed with the data that was coming out, and the standard acceleration chart was incredibly intriguing because and the argument for and against it became intriguing. And so I followed as much of that work as I could. And then one day I simply wrote Ogden a letter and told him who I was and that I would like to be considered as a doctoral student. And I didn't hear from him for almost an entire year. And I still remember the Saturday before Easter in 1972, I got a phone call and he said, "This Pat McGreevy?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "This is Ogden Lindsley." And I about passed out. I was just stunned. and he kept me on the phone for an hour and a half and made arrangements for me to come to Lawrence, Kansas in a couple of weeks to interview. And I spent a weekend interviewing. And he said, he accepted me as a doctoral student. And 2 months later, I arrived in Lawrence, Kansas, and I spent the next 2 years with him. And then I moved off to Seattle and went back to teaching simply because I couldn't afford to be a graduate student anymore. I barely had enough to keep body and soul together. And so I got a teaching job and worked on my dissertation for the succeeding 4 years.
Oh, that's great. So, when I met Og, it was a very interesting experience. He was quite a character. So I was wondering if you have any stories to share or anything that you might want to share with us. I know his history is pretty interesting. If I'm correct, he was a prisoner of war during World War II. I don't know if that seems to be in his biography.
Yes, and he jumped out of an airplane in World War II and was behind enemy lines for some time. And yes, and although I don't know all the details of that, he talked about it often enough that you could tell it had a tremendous effect on him. Later in his life, when I was his student, he was contemplating buying a car, and he was contemplating a Mercedes, one of the diesel Mercedes, the lesser expensive Mercedes cars. And he struggled with it for weeks and weeks. I remember him saying to me, I like this car. I like the fact that it's diesel, it's less polluting, it's a safe car. But what I can't get past is it's made by Germans. And he struggled with that enormously. And finally, he just decided that he had to let that go, that it was a German car, because there was so much left over from the war.
Yeah, it was a difficult time. If I'm correct, what I
Oh.
read was that he was captured on his 22nd birthday,
Was.
which I can't even imagine me at 22 and dealing with all that. But it just goes to show you the interesting roads we take on the way to where we are. So I didn't want to interrupt you. I just
No.
was very interested in OG. So you got your doctoral degree, and then what?
And then I went back to I went back to teaching for a short time, and I remember in the middle of a school year, I went from Mr. McGreevy to Dr. McGreevy, and the principal refused to address me that way, which was fine with me. I wasn't comfortable with the term anyway. But and then eventually I moved to Kansas City, which had been temporary home some time ago. And then I worked for the University of Missouri as an adjunct professor. And I was teaching courses in special education and also traveling to adult facilities around the state of Missouri, helping people program for adults with severe developmental disabilities. And then one day my boss and I had a pretty substantial disagreement, and I decided that I couldn't be there anymore with this person. And so I looked around and found that the Louisiana State University was looking for a professor to teach their courses in severe disabilities. And so I applied, and I think I was probably only one of 2 or 3 people that applied. And so off I went to LSU and had a whole batch of undergraduate and master's students for the space of about 3 years, until the price of oil dropped one day catastrophically. And LSU laid off 800 professors in one day.
Wow.
And I was one of those people. And we knew it was coming, but it didn't help. And then I went off to Florida, and I've been in Florida ever since. And I decided that I wasn't going to go back and be a full-time university person. I was much more interested in application. And so from there on in, I became a consultant to school districts, group homes, all sorts of places. And at times I worked for the state of Florida. And then eventually I had developed a private practice of my own and traveled literally all over the world. And again, focusing on children and adults with severe developmental disabilities, meaning people that were whose conditions were extraordinary. Children who were deaf and blind, children who were deaf and blind and orthopedically impaired, children that had, and adults that had, that were medically fragile. And then in 2012, after about 7 years of writing, Troy Fry and I published our curriculum, Essential for Living. And then I've just continued my work through that.
That's great. You know, one of the first things I learned about that was that it is not essentials for living, it is essential for living. Am I correct in that?
That is correct. We had quite a debate about that just before we went to the printers. And I have to tell you that of all the people that I asked, more people recommended essentials, plural, than recommended essential. But it was my decision, and I decided on essential. But to this day, a lot of people refer to it as essentials.
Yeah, I've heard people make that mistake, but it's been hugely popular, and probably because you've put everything, you know, that you've experienced in your life and what you've learned into that. And, you know, it's a really, really good assessment. I know that, you know, the staff that I had when I was directing a program loved that assessment and still do. As a matter of fact, I can say now, I can put out a little ad here that Pat is going to do a webinar for the BALC in a week's time at 2:30 p.m. on the 15th. And we'll be talking more about that. And what is it going to be about, Pat?
Well, we're going to talk about all sorts of aspects of teaching functional life skills to people. And And especially now in two different circumstances that becomes relevant. In public school classrooms, whether the children have autism or not, they may have some other significant developmental disability. Many states would require that their education be tagged to the Common Core state standards, which are academic standards, formal academic standards. And in our opinion, it's gone to such an extreme now that it's actually resulting in kids sitting in lessons after lessons that they can't possibly understand. And even if they understood a minimal amount of it, what would they ever do with it? So that's one example. And the second example is many children with autism are in developmental curricula that are tagged to typical development or typical language development. And that's fine for some kids who continue to progress well developmentally, but almost surely somewhere in the range of 60 to 70% don't go that route and that have autism. And the question is, where do they go if they're no longer, I mean, if you have a 9 or 10-year-old child whose language is the level of a 2.5-year-old child, do you continue to program for them as if they could catch up to their peers when that bus has probably already left? And it would be much more useful to begin to program for the rest of their life and to focus in on quality of life and functional skills.
Well, that's a great little teaser there for people to come to the webinar, which I think is titled Most Frequently Asked Questions About the EFL or something like that, which
Yep.
already has a significant number of registrants. Before I move back to our general topic, I just do want to mention that Behavior Development Solutions in the BALC have now partnered on the bookstore. And Pat has generously offered a $20 discount starting on the day of his webinar through the end of the year. So I want to put that out there, and you'll be hearing more about that. But I don't want to pull away from Pat right now because I'm finding this really interesting. And I'm going to ask a bigger question now, because you were around when basically behavior analysis got started, Pat, or close to it. How do you see the field is changing over the past several decades?
Boy, you could.
Yeah, I said it was a big question.
It is. You can go several different ways with this, but I think what happened for a while in the early days, and I wasn't early, but I was, not too far along in the process of behavior analysis becoming an applied field of endeavor. And I learned from Ogden and from Nate Azarin and people like Richard Fox and people like Eric Houghton, which many young behavior analysts don't even know that name, but he was an early student of Skinner's, and people who came along after that, just slightly after that, like Kent Johnson and Joe Lang and people like that, who shared Ogden's vision of behavior analysis becoming the applied natural science of behavior. And I think to some extent that aspiration has been achieved, with one major exception, and that is our measurement is all over the place, literally all over the place. Mm-hmm. And we have adopted percent, which isn't even the measure of behavior. And so that's sort of held us back from it becoming more of a science, a natural science, which is also was what Skinner saw it as a great potential. But over the years, there's been that struggle. There's a relatively small group of behavior analysts, including myself and people who were largely taught by Ogden and his colleagues, that have struggled to make behavior analysis more of a science with respect to measurement. And I think it's been a struggle. but at the same time, supporting though most everything that one would imagine, well, not one would imagine, that one would see as part of the current dimensions article of Bear, Wolf, and Risley. The only thing that we would have wanted that didn't occur is that there were 7 dimensions and one of them was not measurement. Now that to us seems very different than what Skinner had in mind, and very different. And so, so there's been that sort of a struggle, but at the same time, there's been a great advances in technology, teaching procedures. I think probably the most significant teaching procedure of all is stimulus control transfer. If you can transfer stimulus control, you can be a powerful practitioner. And many special education teachers don't even know it by that name, but they know it as prompting and prompt fading. But that's exactly what it is. And if you become even modestly good at that, you can be an incredibly good teacher. And Mark Sundberg's work and many others has just been phenomenal. Vince Carbone, to name just a few people. But then when autism came along and we had at the same time the emergence of certification, the incredible work of my good friend Jerry Shook. Jerry Shook hired me when I came to Florida years ago, and he and I got to be good friends. And then when that was going more from Florida and California and Oklahoma, and then it went national and later international, and it paired up with Autism Speaks and the autism groups. And the problem, I think, is there's such a need in autism because there's so many kids, but we all grew too fast. And so we have young people coming out today who have basically a very limited knowledge of behavior analysis, and that's certainly not their fault, but they've been trained too rapidly, in a sense, to meet this need. And I mean, gosh sakes, when I was learning it, I would never have sat down with somebody and thought that I could function behaviorally after 3 years of training. That would never have occurred to me, and nor anybody around me. It wasn't just me. I didn't know anybody around me who would do things like that. I mean, I'd experiment with little things, but I used to say that I knew enough behavior analysis to be dangerous, and that was about the size of it. And but I think that what we have to kind of pull back and do a little bit better job is our training programs, and slow down just a little bit and make sure that our people who come out, because some of them are coming right out of school and they're faced with a child or a young adult who has a very limited repertoire, and almost nothing that they had in their coursework would prepare them.
Right. You know, that's so true. And just to segue back into leadership, that's one of the BALC's objective, is to support people that don't have a ton of experience either in behavior analysis, but particularly in leadership, because so we have new behavior analysts coming out, and there's so many jobs and so many needs that some of those people are getting elevated to leadership positions in a couple of years with very little experience managing people or doing anything related to leadership. And it's just such a difficult situation. I did want to turn to a couple of questions. We're running a little bit short on time, but what about your life, Pat? The impact of leaders on your life? Is there anybody in particular besides Ogden that you want to mention, or any aspect of that you could throw out here?
Yeah, especially the people in education that many people today don't even hear about in some of their coursework. People like Wes Becker and Zig Engelman and people like that, that were special educators. They weren't psychology people who got into behavior analysis. They were special educators. They were education people. People like Sam Dietz and I'm gonna forget some names now. The gentleman who was at Kentucky, whose name is escaping me at the moment, and Northern Illinois, Mark Durand. and Ted Carr, and goodness sake, then some of these names will, escape me at the moment, but I think that those people, Jerry Patterson's another one. Those were people that tried to put behavior analysis into plain language, put it applied in simple, basic settings. And those people had tremendous influence on me. Particularly Wes Becker, whose book, Parents Are Teachers, and Jerry Patterson's book, Living with Children. And
so what made them good leaders, Pat? Like you said, like what makes a good leader?
They had a sense of science and practice at the same time. How do you translate science to practice? That for me was a big, big deal, because I found that some scientists, if you couldn't, and recently I wrote an article that was rejected for a journal, and part of the reason they said it was rejected is because I said things in there that we said that the article would be partly commentary and that would be partly based on data. And we acknowledged that up front, but they said, well, some of the things you talked about, there's no data to support that. Well, the answer is yes, there's no data on that subject, period. So you can't go on with practice just based solely on what the literature tells you, because the literature doesn't cover a whole bunch of things. Right. And so how do you take your basic, like Jack Michael used to say to me, he'd say, when you leave home, you always take your concepts and principles. And Jack's famous book was called what? Concepts and Principles. That's what it was called. Surprise, surprise. He said, you take your concepts and principles, and when there's no data to support something, your concepts and principles will always bring you home. And I think those early people did that. They did that. And they started to recommend ways to prompt that had never been examined in the literature, or at least on a very peripheral level. And so I always admired those people who were good scientists, but, Wes Becker used to say, okay, now that we've talked about it, how do we do it?
Right. Great question.
How do we do it?
Yeah. So given that, Pat, and there's a lot of new behavior analysts probably watching at this point who aspire to improve their positions and to have more responsibilities, what advice would you give to future leaders in behavior analysis?
If you are a leader in a leadership position and you sense that some of the things that you are going to be doing to guide other people are not based on your experience other than reading, find somebody who can show you. Seriously. Because if you're going to be a good practitioner, talking about it and doing it are two very different things. And having your concepts and principles organizes your doing. It organizes your doing, but it doesn't cover all the little details of the doing, but it organizes them. And I think that if you guide somebody on stimulus control transfer, if you can find yourself, if one of your people that you are supervising asks you for this with a child, if you're not prepared to sit down with that child and show them, go get yourself prepared to do that.
Great advice. Great advice. Well, Pat, I met you at NISABA, I believe, and when you agreed to do the spotlight. I am going to reveal that I'm going to be 62 in June, and believe it or not, I'm working more than 40 hours a week at this point, and I think it's time to turn a little bit more to family. So I've really enjoyed this position as executive director for the BALC, but I've decided I'm going to be resigning it as of January and focus a little bit more on my kids and some other things. So you are my last spotlight. That's what I was leading into. So I'm the first executive director for BALC, and you're my last spotlight. So hopefully they'll continue to do these spotlights, but I want to really thank you for that.
Well, thank you for your work as well and for doing what you do. I appreciate it a lot.
So what's next for you? I talked a little bit about what's next for me. What's next for Pat McGreevy?
We are working on a teaching manual to supplement the curriculum, where we focus almost exclusively on teaching procedures. We have changed the focus from protocols to guidelines, so that we talk about things you should think about when you're teaching these kinds of skills. And so we sort of soured on protocols. They're more like recipes, and we've kind of soured on that. So the next thing is the teaching manual, and Essential for Living is being translated now into 5 different languages.
Oh, fantastic.
So there'll be a lot of work in that area. But I am 76 years old, and I'm lucky enough to be in good health, but I don't know how much longer I'll do this, maybe a short time, but I don't know. We'll just have to wait and see how the
I don't know.
health comes out.
I think you're lasting longer than I am. But you know, the BALC is a great organization, and it is a very much needed organization. So, you know, I want everybody to know that Pat's been very supportive. And remember, you guys, we have a conference coming up in Miami. So, you know, please be sure to check that out and check out our site. Pat, if you hold on, you can even keep your video on. I'm going to share our last slide here. And I just want to conclude by saying thank you very much for today and for attending for whatever events that I or the BALC has done. We want to wish you to stay safe and be well.